so from this week, now this week is the last week that we are completing the requirement specifications for your subsystem. Okay, and then the next week we need to design the user interface for one of your use cases that you have identified. So that is what we are focusing in today's lecture, right? Now let's go through what we have to learn today. So the user interface design actually is one of the activities of the fourth core process. Remember the system development life cycle core processes that we have discussed. It is one of the activities of the fourth core process, system design or design system components core process, if you recall correctly. Now actually the system designing the user interfaces has characteristics of both analysis activities and also design activities, right? So during the system analysis activities, developers usually discuss inputs, outputs early on, right? Remember the early on we discussed these things. And often they discuss with the system stakeholders to identify who are the potential users of the system or the actors, and then what the information they actually require to carry out their business processes, right? And as a design activity, user interface actually design users lots of analysis models, right, as an input. For example, we are using, remember last week we discussed system sequence diagram, so that is one of the input that we use for user interface design. And also in this core process or in the user interface design area, we also produce some models in the form of sample kind of screens or layouts that are used by the programmers to implement the final system in your subsystem. So today what we will learn are the concepts and techniques that will assist us as a system analyst to design the screens and design the reports that are rich and engaging and more efficient, right? So that that users feel that we have developed a more user-friendly system and more effective interface for them to interact with the system. So the thing that we need to actually understand nowadays, users are doing much more with much more work with multiple computing devices. The systems are operating in multiple devices. So user interface design has to be concerned with different layouts, different screens, because we use mobile devices frequently, isn't it? And different types of screens, right? Some screens are very small, some screens are very large, moderate screens, right? So we need to consider all these things, because today we need to consider the entire user experience, right? So in other words, what devices are being used and what are the users are doing with these devices, all these things has to be considered when we think about user interface design. So today what we are going to do is we just learn the general guidelines, so general principles and the guidelines, how we're going to apply these things across all the user interfaces and user experience designs in our subsystem. That is what we are trying to tackle in today's topic. Okay, so that is what I have mentioned in the first. So what do you mean by user experience, right? So user experience is a very, I would say it's a kind of a very broad concept that applies to all aspects of the people or the person's interaction with any product or any service, right? So if you think about the product, now what is the product we are talking about here? Product is the software application, and that is the product we are trying to build in. So user experience, or UX, sometimes we call UX, includes actions or responses, perceptions, and feelings that the person has when he or she uses the system, or anticipate using any kind of software application, what kind of things he or she anticipate, right? So responses, perception, everything we need to consider when you think about user experience. So it is important for system designers to think about overall these user experience as they consider the design of the new system, particularly the interface section of the system. Okay, so that is what we mean by the user experience means. Okay, the user interface on the other side, right? So we call it as UI, right? So user interface is kind of a set of inputs and outputs that directly involve in such an application user, right? What inputs, what kind of inputs the user is trying to interact with the system. So what are the outputs the system is going to generate? So these are the things actually user interface basically focusing on. So the user interface is a major element in a total user's experience, I would say, right? So both the consideration of user experience and the user interface, both considerations related to the total user's experience with respect to the system. So it actually it's the we even though we have a very good better system analysis or system design, it doesn't matter for the success of the system if you don't design better experience for the user. That is what ultimately what I'm trying to tell you, right? um, so that is very important from the user's perspective. So if you think about this diagram, it actually illustrates the complex nature of users interaction with the system. So you can see the users nowadays, they use a different kind of I mean, from the user's perspective, the user interface is the entire system, right? It doesn't matter which hardware devices, which programs or which scripts or which databases they are using or behind the interface. They are using, but what they want is the entire user experience. So all these things are irrelevant for the user's perspective, right? So yeah, actually the good system design makes all these elements transparent to the user. That's what we need to be very careful when you're designing a system, user interface. Um, so there is a design technique that we can use to embody all these point of view, all these things into a better user experience. We call this user-centered design. Okay, we call it as a user-centered design. That is what we mean by this. Okay? When you input all these elements together. So that's a kind of a bit tricky area, because we need to have a better element, because it's actually psychology also comes into play when you're designing better user experience, isn't it? How the users think, so what they need, how they interact, right? So all these things. Okay. Um, so so basically so there are three basically principles, I can say three important principles that we need to focus in when you design the user-centered design aspects into our system. So first one is we need to focus early and throughout the project on the users and their work, right? What do we mean by that? And early focus on the users and their work is it's actually, I think it's a consistent with an approach to the system analysis that we learn. User-oriented analysis, user-oriented design tasks we usually performing early as possible, right? Remember that we discuss the user requirement and we capture the user requirement, and that is actually consistent Now remember that I have told you in system analysis, in early on we're trying to design some screens or layouts in order to get their feedback. Um, so that is actually consistent if you focus the user's work, user's task and their work early on in the system analysis, to give them a kind of to get a kind of an idea how the system works. And then the second principle of the user-centered design is to evaluate the designs to ensure the usability of the system, right? So what do you mean by the usability? Usability actually refers to how easy the system is to learn to use, because we need to ensure that usability isn't jeopardize, kind of the system users. Because if you think about any system, there are many different types of users with the uh, different skills or different preferences, right? If the system has a variety of end users, how can a system designer, right? So be sure that the interface will work well with all of them, right? How can we make sure? So that is kind of a usability issue that we need to be very careful when it comes to, because we can't have kind of a too flexible system, right? If you have too flexible system, some users might feel, oh, I lost this system because it's too much of information, or it's it take a lot of time for me to navigate, right? But on the other hand, the interface has to be too rigid, because some users will be frustrated because of that, right? So it has to be kind of a, you need to actually properly balance the number of interfaces, and then a number of users. Who are the users we are trying to engage in the system that we are trying to develop? So evaluating the design to ensure usability is one of the key aspect that we need to consider. And then the third principle is in the user-centered design is the what do you call the so-called iterative development. Because remember that, as I mentioned before, by doing some analysis, then doing some design, then doing some implementation, and then repeating these processes actually will give you a kind of enough detail for the business analyst to capture the requirement and the user interface requirements very in early stages, and then get kind of a better picture about users requirement, what they need, what kind of interfaces they prefer, how effective we can capture the data that users are going to input into the system, etc., etc., right? So yeah, so that is something. So these are the three principles I think is more important when it comes to the user interface or user interface design. Now there are three actually researchers. I think Jacob Nielsen, Donald Norman, and there's another guy called I think Bruce Togsany or some I can't remember the exact. So they are the one who actually come up with the idea, this human computer interaction. So the human computer interaction kind of concept. Now this is a kind of a field of this is actually established field in the research in IT field. It's concerned with the efficiency and effectiveness of the interface design for a computer system, right? So there are a lot of research on these areas. I am not actually specialized in that particular area, but if you are interested, if you Google it, you will see there are a lot of concepts involved in HCI or human computer interaction side, okay? Which you may be considered important in your future studies. So we need to consider some of these concepts in our interface design um, in here. Okay. Now, basically, what do you mean by the interface design? We're designing the screens, right? We need to capture the data from the user. Sometimes we need to produce information back to the user. So how well we can design these things? This is what we consider in user interfaces. So one thing that we need to actually consider when user interface design construction needs metaphors of human-computer interaction to make computers very easier to use and learn. So we, as a designers or system analysts or system designers, we need to visually orient interface adapted to some kind of metaphors, right? So a kind of analogies between some features of the user interface and the aspects of the physical reality that the users are familiar with. So that is what we mean by this. Okay. So there are basically different metaphors we can use. The first one is called the direct manipulation metaphor. So in here, what we have doing is here we're trying to capture the object or represent the object display in a kind of in the physical looks like for example, if I use a desk to organize something, how the desk, what are the things, components in the desk, right? So objects physically, how the object physically looks like, that is what do you mean by direct manipulation method, right? Or we represent the physical objects. And then I think I have an example here. Do we have yeah, so kind of small screens. We have these small buttons, looks like, you know, direct objects like what we usually use. So that is what we mean by the direct object metaphor means. And then we have a desktop metaphor. So we visually organize into distinct regions, because you know in a desk, so usually in the desk we organize things in a way, write books in one place, our pens are in the different place. So this is another method we use to organize things. So we use these kind of method to organize the menus, basically, right? How to organize menus, how to organize components, right? So you can see here in Microsoft Word, right? So we organize things accordingly, right? In a different categories. So that is what we mean by desktop metaphor. And then we have the document metaphor. So we use data visually to represent as a paper pages or the forms like this. So because they need to actually give you a kind of a richer details about how this work. It will give a kind of better idea for the users how they should interact with the system rather than having more confusion, right? So that is what we mean by the document metaphor. So because the entire display need to be visually similar to the surface of physical desktop sometimes, right? So for example, in here in this case, maybe it looks like it has to be feel like a kind of a paper in the usual normal physical paper. Simply that is what we mean by the document metaphor. And then we have called dialogue metaphor. So here what we dialogue method, what we try to actually represent how the dialogue goes in the real life, like okay, if the two people talk to each other, how the dialogue happens, how the information flows, how can we represent that the same thing or same feature in a system, representing the system or the user interface, because the user interacting with the system. So if, for example, now I am interacting with the system to deliver the component, so how I communicate with this system to produce something that meaningful for you guys, right, as the listeners in the other side. So these kind of metaphors we usually use to represent the interface aspects. The end users are more familiar in their day-to-day life, so they can quickly learn how to use new information systems more without having any problems, right? So something that you have to think about when you're designing the screens. Okay, so here I have given some example. So the description of each metaphor, what do you mean by each metaphor, and then some examples that you can actually work on. yeah, so this represent the document metaphors and all these desktop and manipulation metaphors in this diagram. Okay. So this is the example of the dialogue metaphor which I have talked earlier. So this kind of communication, how we want to represent in our user interface, right? So the user is requesting something, and then the system saying that okay, we have this, so you can ready to start this one, right? Etc., etc. So how are we going to implement these kind of communication between the system and the user more productively in the system screen or the interface is something that we need to be careful, to be careful. And then when you think about system interface design or user interface design, human interface objects are actually give a part. I mean, give a kind of another person. You need to be very careful when you design. And you can see this. This is an example because when you think about when you're designing some. Now here, this is I think the online player or something like DVD player, music player kind of thing. Um, so sometimes you can, when you put a kind of an objects in a screen, we need to give some more tool tips kind of, right? So if you hover the mouse over some of these objects, it will give you kind of a suggestion how the how that object functions, right? Because that is very important from the user's perspective. It's not that you listing these objects or functionalities in the screen, but it has to give a kind of a idea how we operate. Now that is what we mean by the folder. That is actually one of the key principles in user interface design. Um, and then we have this human interface objects design principles. We need to be a bit concerned. um, uh, so we need to actually give us some kind of a feedback to system how. Now if the system, if the user interact with the system or use some of these functionalities, so we should give a kind of a visual feedback for them as well sometimes, because sometimes the user itself will not have a kind of a clue how it operate and whether they have operated in the right button or right checkbox, etc., etc. Um, so the feedback part of other visual objects are very important, because this will give you a kind of a better idea for the users how effective their input to the system is, because we use these screens to capture some of the users actions, isn't it? So we can use a different interface objects depending on the situation you are talking about. We can use the radio buttons, right? So or check boxes, right? Because these radio buttons, check boxes actually function differently, right? I think I need not to told you, because you have done these things in your web design course, why we need radio buttons, why we need checkbox, because they work differently for different purposes, right? So something that we need to think about, right? So the feedback provides the user with a sense of kind of a, I would say, a confirmation, and the feeling that the system is responsive, right, functioning correctly. Otherwise the users will not engage with the system, and then the system may be a totally a failure, or sometimes the users may think that okay, why this particular command or why this particular button is not working or not recognizing my actions. Right now we may have actually experienced that most of our programs sometimes, right, we said, oh my god, this system is not operating very well because the button not clicking and then not responsive, no, right? Sometimes you need to refresh the whole system, right? So we don't want that to happen in the system that we design. So this is actually a better way to think about when you're trying to recognize the things, right? So they're very important. Another thing, other important thing is consistency. Consistency is very important. Consistency can apply to many different, I would say, aspects of the user interface designs, as well as to the application itself, right? Not only the user interface design, but for the application as well. One thing you need to remember is the effectiveness of the user experience is highly dependent on the consistency, right? So effectiveness and consistency is very important, right? Users not only expect the consistency across various. Now, if you have a kind of a various, system with different screens, the consistency is not only that, right? For example, if you have 4 screens or 5 screens or 6 screens in a specific menu, uh, so the consistency not only the variation of the screens between different menu items, um, but also they anticipate kind of a consistency across the applications as well, right? For example, if you're trying to design, say for example, your subsystem is a part of the total system you guys are developing as a group of students, right? So you may have 2 or 3 members developing different subsystems. How consistent your screens objects between different subsystem is another consideration, right? That is what we mean by within the suits of application consistency, right? So very important. And then consistency within a particular application, as I mentioned, is very important as well, because we use different kind of inputs, different kind of display screens within an application. So we can use different font sizes, different colors, bolding labels or bolding, data fields, etc., etc. What we need to, at the end, what we need to ensure is all these colors, type, sizes, or kind of labels we use will not going to confuse the user, but it does result in an inconsistent, more productive kind of engagement. That is what we need to ensure, right? Because we need to be a bit professionally look when you design the system as well. So that consistency has to be there. So that is what we mean by the consistency, right? So consistency not mean the consistency since itself. It has a different meanings, depends on the system we are talking about. Okay. And then the other important feature is continuity. Continuity regarding the system, right? The continuity means now sometimes we need to release the system part by part over the time, or sometimes the system has to be upgraded over the time. They are different because there may be some kind of a, so that consistency across the releases over the time is very important as well. We don't want all of a sudden, when we get a kind of an upgraded system, it's totally different to the previous version. We don't want that to happen, isn't it? You may have actually noticed that in the operating system, Windows operating system, I would say, I think the Windows 8 is a little bit, because when they released the Windows 8, now remember Microsoft, those are the days that Windows, they have, not the Windows, I mean the mobile phones, so or smartphones are very popular, and they're trying to come into that particular area, Microsoft, and they have released so many releases, 8.1, 8.5, etc., etc. We have a lot of confusion. So Windows, from Windows 7 to Windows 8 is a huge jump, right? Isn't it? Huge jump. So we took a lot of time to get adjusted to the Windows 8 environment. Now, but in Windows 10, we have learned the users very much. So we overcome that probability issue. So it will be a bit careful when you design the systems also. This concept is very important, not a sudden jump from one version to another version in terms of the user interfaces, because it actually confuses will confuse us the users actions. So that's something we need to be a bit careful. And then other important principle that we need to consider when it comes to the user interface design is discoverability, right? So you know that many applications have more features than it can be shown in the initial user interface, right? So many applications. So how can we actually how can we provide all these things to the users? So how can we organize all these functionalities to the users in a more effective way? Um, uh, uh, so so we don't want to kind of produce kind of very cluttered, very complex looking interface to the users. It's not good, right? So it's not good for the psychologically. The users will engage with the system, and then effectively it will be eventually it will be get fail the system, right? So discoverability is something that we need to present the system features in a way that users can discover these hidden features without having much effort, right? Uh, so how can we give some clues to help users to uncover these hidden features, right? So that's something we need to be aware of, right? That is why we have this concept called active discovery. So this is kind of a user interface feature that leads users to discovering hidden features without having any problem. Maybe we can organize in a kind of a tabs, right? You know, in the screens, which you organize the information in the tab, so users can specifically pointing on, okay, this feature, maybe the music, maybe the photo feature is there, maybe the video that I'm looking at has to be there, etc., etc. So this is something actually that we can keep remembering when you're designing the interfaces, okay? Or maybe sometimes we can provide some kind of a visual diagrams to guide the users to how to locate some items, right? For example, we can, this is kind of a, especially this is helpful when it comes to mobile devices, right? Because if you think about desktop kind of applications, we have a lot of space that we can provide more information, but how can you know provide these features to mobile kind of small devices is a bit of a challenge, right? So these kind of small visual diagrams will guide users um, that they can actually find out the hidden kind of the features or functionalities of the application without having any problem, okay? um, and then we have a kind of another principle called the closure. This is actually the idea of closure is a kind of a, it's a based on the kind of a dialogue method which I have introduced earlier. In most cases, especially for organization procedures, if you think about the organization procedures, um, now now we represent these procedures using use cases, right? So we have use cases, it represent the procedures or steps that that users need to take to complete a specific task, right? Sometimes in order to complete complete these steps, we need to have kind of multiple screens, right? Or sometimes it can be done with a single screen, right? Rather than going through step by step, next button, we can actually complete all these steps in a particular use case. For example, say process custom order, right? Rather than having multiple screens to have that particular use case, we can have one screen or two screen, right? Um, so So what we need to do is, whenever the case is, what we need to provide users, right, in order to complete a specific task. The interface has to be very clearly defined what are the steps required for that particular activity for the user, right? And what is the where is the beginning activity, where the end activity. So that these things need to be clearly specified in the screens that we provide to the user. That is what the closure basically means, right? So it's actually very tricky thing sometimes, because sometimes when you, for example, when you, now you may have actually noticed this. Some application, especially web-based application, when you fill something web form, and if you kind of do, if you did a kind of a mistake or something, you try to go back by clicking the back button of the browser, then all of a sudden the whole form will be gone, right? So how are you going to that's not that good. That is very not a good thing to give, right? Because the users need to come back and put all the information back to the screen, right? So we need to actually protect the users' data, but at the same time, how can we minimize users to input the information again and again? Because unless, for example, if I type my name and address and phone number again and again, it frustrates me, right? So that is something we need to be careful when you're designing the user interfaces. So how will you provide some undo or reverse actions? That is what we mean by that, right? To make that users are not disengaged with the system. And then the readability and navigation, it's something that need to be very important when you design, especially the web-based applications. When you design, we need to actually think about the color type, size of the screen, or size of the dialog boxes. So all these things are, if you think about this example, it's a kind of, you can't even think about what is this screen actually they trying to do, because you can see the fonts are different fonts, and the fonts styles are different, and even sometimes it's very hard to read. Now imagine that this screen is displaying in your mobile device, then it will be really very difficult as a users to read what actually means, what trying to explain, what kind of instruction it tells the users to take. So readability and navigation is something that we need to be very careful, because we need to provide a kind of clear text. Uh, text has to be very clear, and it has to be fit with the different devices, right? Because we can expect the users to use different kind of devices nowadays to interact with the application that we develop. So how are we going to tackle that issue? Um, that's something that we need to be a bit careful as well. And always always actually we need to have a kind of have something like a way out from the applications. So we call it as I don't know whether nowadays the application, web-based application use called a concept for breadcrumbs in the navigation. I don't know whether you have heard. I think you have heard that in your web development. So you can see kind of we can actually in the top of the screen you may have seen that in the website, when you go deep and deep into the different menu section, you can see which section you are in. And then even if you go back to a different section by clicking that links, like you may have seen that displaying the kind of sequence of pages you can traverse to, through. So that is called the breadcrumbs. So that is actually a good part when you're designing the web-based applications, because we need to provide the clear navigation. And then the other important thing that we need to actually consider is the usability and the efficiency aspects. This is one of the primary, I think, design consideration in the user interface design, how to increase the users' efficiencies and the effectiveness of the users. Because the entire user experience is very important in any application development. Um, so there are three, basically I would say there are the three issues need to be considered when you think about usability and effectiveness on your application. The one of the important thing is so most of the applications we need to provide a kind of a shortcut keys to support experienced users. As I mentioned before, because we can expect some users are more experienced, some users are novice to the system. So how, we have to provide some kind of a shortcut approach for the experienced user. For example, in Microsoft environment, we use control, C to copy, control, so the control A to select, control C to copy, control, control V to copy, control C to copy, etc. Kind of things, right? So it's a shortcut keys. I hardly actually use it. I use the mouse key and stuff. So sometimes it's very good because, but the challenge is these shortcut keys again. It depends on the application you are developing. If you think about, say, mobile devices or cross the application that work across a different kind of environment, then how can you give the shortcut keys to different environment? That is another challenge. Okay, so that's something that you need to think about. And then if the error, if the users make errors in during the processing activities, so we need to provide some meaningful error messages so users can effectively know, right, what kind of mistakes they have made, how we're going to correct that error. Okay, so that is something that we can think about when you trying to design design user interface. And then of course the what do you call this, simplicity is something that we need to be careful about when you design the user interfaces. So we have this called KISS, or KISS. So keep it simple, stupid principle. Right? That is what you keep it simple, stupid principle. Uh, so what it says is keep it simple, right? Keep it simple when you're designing the applications. Fewer mouse clicks, right? So we don't want different mouse go. You may have noticed some applications, if you click, you need to go very deep into the menu system to get into a kind of a one action. We don't want that, right? So keep it simple. Simpler interfaces will increase the user interaction with the system. So better user experience, right? That is something that we need to be very careful about as well. And then uh, so also when you design the navigation and the screens, it has to be give a clear path for the users how they can navigate throughout the web pages to going to another web page, etc., etc. So that is also a part of the usability as well, and also it's efficiency as well, because if you think about these kind of complex menu system in office environment, right? Office use systems, how productive it is, right? So it needs to be considered as well when you're designing the menu items, right? And then yeah, so this is an example of Ridgeline Mountain outfit. That is a case study we have used regularly in our discussions. So they have designed this very clean and very simple homepage for customers. So you can see that the menus are organized in a way that if you go, when you travel through this menu, it highlights, and the rest of the menu will highlight in the in white background. Okay. And then inside the menu they have sub menus, and then it actually listed clearly shows what to do, what to expect, or what are the functionalities provided by the system. So that is something that we need to consider when you design the system interface um, in your subsystem. Right, now the next thing is how we're going to transition from system analysis model to user interface design. That is something we need to be very careful. So one of the things that we need to consider is now you already have developed the use cases, right? So we use the event tables, we identify the use cases, and then use cases actually. Now remember last week or week before the last, I have gave you kind of an examples, and also I have discussed when you design the use cases, you need to actually, when you provide the use case description, you need to clearly provide um, um, the interaction between the users and the system, right? And all these things in the use case that we consider provide a kind of a stepping stone to guide us to design the menus or menu hierarchies, right? So the menus actually provide the kind of mechanism that kind of how the users, what kind of functionalities the system provide, and we expect from the user. That's actually what the menus are actually why we design the menus, right? So when you have the user can activate one part of the menu and it will invoke some kind of an activity in the system, right? So basically, so we use these menus to organize the use cases or that's basically the steps in the use cases to represent the functionality, uh, and uh, and then we need to consider the different types of users, right? Different types of users, because different types of users have different kind of meaning, because some users may prefer to use mobile devices than other users. Other users maybe use more desktop applications, right? So the menu items that we use to represent specific functionality or to represent specific use need to be think twice, right? How you going to organize the menu, because you may have seen that the menus used in desktop is quite different to menus used in mobile devices, because we have smaller screen sizes, right? Um, so you need to actually think about how you're going to design the overall menu items, right, for a given use case or given set of use cases. Is one of the things that we need to be very, because that is very important early on when it comes to the system design or system analysis activity. Um, um, so the first thing that we need to think about is hierarchy of the menu, right? So how are we going to hierarchy? Which menu is the first one, which menu is the second one, etc. So how you place these menu items, right? How we're going to organize the menu items in a way that give you a kind of a. So for example, if you think about this example, these are two examples of how we do the menu. So we can actually organize menus in a vertical fashion or a horizontal fashion, and then we can organize the menus in different functional areas. If you think about this Microsoft Word kind of thing, you can see kind of they organize the menus in a different tabs, and then inside the tabs they have different sub menus. So each sub menu represent different functionality, right? Compared to the website that they use, it's a more vertical kind of the second one is more horizontal, the first one is more vertical kind of menus. They organize their systems. And then actually the first thing we can do is when it comes to the menu design is we need to identify what are the subsystem we have, in which subsystem we are building in the system, and then we organize the use cases based on the subsystem, right? Okay, so which use cases have which subsystems, what are the subsystems, what are the use cases attached to different subsystems. So then we can kind of get a kind of an idea how many use cases we have with respect to different subsystem. And then of course what we can do is we can think about who are the actors engaged in different subsystems, right? Because different actors may require different user interfaces, so different different menu items depending on which part of the use case they are invoking in. Now remember in my earlier discussion last week, in use case diagrams also we some users can't invoke some of the use cases, right? But some other users can. So that is very important when you designing the interfaces, right? Because we don't need to use functionality for some of the users which we not intended to use that particular portion of the system. So we need to organize the users according to the subsystem. And then of course what we can do is we can actually we can group them into the first cut menu hierarchy. So as a rule of thumb, normally the how many menu items we require, it depends on how many use cases we use in a subsystem. For example, if you have now, as a rule of thumb, we divided the whole total use cases used in the system by 5. So that will give you a kind of an idea what is the total higher level menu items we require. For example, in this case, we have around, I think, 19 or 19 use cases. If you divide it by 5, so basically we need around 4 menu high level menu items or menu categories, I would say, for this particular system. So here I have put kind of 4 items or 4 high level menu items. For example, this is an example of our case study, Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters. So these are the total use cases. They have this customer, so-called what you call CSMS project, Consolidated Sales and Marketing Project. Remember, I have discussed that in very first week. So that project, they have 19 use cases. So they may think, okay, we may have a 4 upper level menu items in the system, right? And then we can go to each use case and see what are the sub menu choices or menu choices that we can elaborate in each of these categories of the main menus. Okay, and then of course we can find out who are the intended users of menu categories. So in that way, we can actually get a kind of a clue what kind of menu options or what are the menus, what are the main menus we can establish in our application that we are developing, right? So you don't need to go through these kind of things if you are trying to buy a package from a third-party supplier rather than developing systems from the scratch. And sometimes even third-party suppliers, if they supply some systems, we should be able to modify these systems, right? So we can actually still apply these concepts, right? And then one of the key things that we need to actually design, this is what you need to do in your project also when you are trying to establish user interfaces. First, we need to actually develop system sequence diagram, because this system sequence diagram give you an idea how many interactions, so how the interaction work between the user and the system. Okay. And then that actually give you a kind of an idea whether how many screens we require for a given use case. Okay, for example, now this is one of the use cases. I think this is creating a new customer use case. So this is how the actor is interacting with the system. These are the messages. So this is kind of how the actor is invoking particular functionality in the system. So you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, but there is two lines here. Remember that I have told you here we have the customer is entering the address to the system, and then the system is sending the customer address or displaying the customer address back. So that means there are two here. So basically there are 6 interaction between the customer and the system. So does it mean that do we need the 6 screens to show these 6 interactions, right? So not necessarily, right? Because we can actually sometimes we can group. For example, here the customer is trying to input the name, phone number, and the email, and then the system is automatically generating the customer ID and displays that information back to the user. So we don't need to have a separate screen to show that information. We can use the same screen for both of these, right? So likewise, we need to think about that, right? For example, now in this case, you can see once the customer shows, sorry, customer fill these components, it shows the customer ID back, right? And then there are some kind of a dialog box, so some kind of a menu control options here, so the customer can either cancel or save, right? So likewise, you need to think about how many screens we need to design. Do we really need, because some options we need not to have a separate screen at all. So so everything is depending on the system sequence diagram. Okay. Right, so this is what we need to do. This is what how we actually model the screens. First, it starts with the use case description, and then once you finalize the use case description, you may have seen that in the final part, the flow of activities, it actually shows the interaction between the user and the system. Then we can transfer that into the system sequence diagram like this, and that actually plays a basis for design our user interface based on that. Okay, so something that you need to think about when you're designing the screens for your subsystem. So one way, one of the one of the ideas that we have, actually one of the tools I would say we can use to design these user interface is storyboards, right? So we can create a kind of a storyboards to represent this. So what we actually do in the storyboard is we now, as I remember that I mentioned that use cases mean the user is interacting with the system, right? So we can actually construct a kind of activities based on a kind of natural language to emphasize how user and the system is interacting. And then we can create a kind of a storyboard to represent that dialogue, showing what is the sequence, what is the first, who is initiating the first communication, how the other person is, or how the actor is responding back. And then we can actually review that with the users, and then we can design the screens. Okay, for example, now this is an example of storyboard. This is what you need to do in your project in next week. You can choose one of the use cases. For example, here I have chose the checkout shopping cart use case, because once the customer has been fill all the shopping details, so how we going to actually implement that, right, in the screen. Now, for example, it starts with the system. It says, what do you want? What would you like to do? And the customer says, I want to check out, right? And then the system again, okay, what is your email address or the account number? And then the user says, my email is such and such, right? Etc. etc. So how are you going to actually implement? How can you use this kind of a dialogue, right? It's just basic that how are you going to implement that in a sketch user interface is like this, right? So this is where the menu saying right now we have designed from the use case point of view. from the system point of view, we have decided, okay, we have major five major items, menu items in our system, right? So one of the item is shopping cart capability, right? In the shopping cart capability, one of the activities or user wanted to checking out, right? Checking out, that is one of the use case. This is the use case, okay? And then so if the customer comes here and then press this one, then that means we are coming to the second screen. It's okay, you need to verify that, right? That is what we mean the second one saying, right? And then once the customer provided that, we need to verify it, and then we need to tell, okay, whether it is true or false, or whether if it is the displayed information is the customer or something else, right? So if it is true, then they say, okay, that's me. Then it goes to the next screen, okay? And then this is how the shipping information comes into play, right? So shipping information here. So it actually shows all the product details with the listed the values, so selling price, and then give the options, different options for shipping, right? So the customer can, so now here in this case, using the radio button, right? So radio button is, the customer can actually press anything, anything. So for example, if you press free, then it will go to the this dialog, okay? And then comes to the next one. If the customer plays that, then the dialog goes in, something like this, okay? And then we can show that in another set of screens, okay? So this is how we actually design the storyboards and the screens in this way. Once you design this, once you actually have these main menu items, and then we can actually populate these submenus by creating the storyboards like this, okay? That is what basically the idea behind this. So this is not that, sometimes it's very tricky, I would say, right? Because it's based on the use case description. Sometimes use case description need to be remodified based on, once you develop the screen, you may have realized, oh, this is not we need, actually this is a bit confusing, and then you need to go back to the use case description, and maybe you may need to remodify the communication between the actor and the system to better to give a better, richer user experience, okay? So that is one thing that you need to remember here, okay? And then there are some other things we need to be considered as well. Is the system is a custom-based application, or is it a browser-based application, or what kind of devices that the users are using to interact with this application, right? And what are the operating system the user use? Because different operating system given different libraries, different functionalities, right? So how can we use the same one? Because we don't want the users, when they log in from the different system or different devices, to feel the system is quite different, because sometimes it be annoying as well. You may have noticed that, right? So if you use the desktop computer to log into the website, and then if I use my mobile phone, maybe I don't want these two system looks different, right? I need to feel the same thing, right? So how do we make sure that it actually reflects the same thing? That's something need to be very carefully planned and very carefully implemented. Otherwise, it's a kind of a wastage of time and wastage of money. Okay. Yeah, sometimes when you're designing this user interface, you need to be very careful about the layout and formatting. Now, can you see this one is very sloppy design, right? So you can see when the users are trying to interact with the system, when their menus, this drop down menu, you can see the drop down menu, it actually goes to the other list box item, right? So it covers up the other information displayed in the system. Okay, so that kind of things you need to be avoided as much as possible. So you need to be purposeful. You need to actually have kind of a purposeful design practices built in. And you need to group this kind of information in a logical way that the users will not going to, confuse when you're trying to search some particular information, right? So try to avoid this kind of designs when it comes to your user interface. And then, of course, can be different types of data entry kind of elements we can implement in our user interfaces, text boxes, list boxes, combo box, etc., etc., and how to use it, in what purposes we are using, what context we are using in, and that is something we need to be very aware of when you are trying to design user interfaces. And then if possible, we need to give some kind of an ability the users to edit some information, right, to minimize the errors, because we need to provide a kind of a editing facility for the users for the data that they have input, because we need to minimize the checkings that we can done by the backend processes, right? So that's something that we need to think about. It depends on which application actually we try to implement. Okay, we don't want a very security kind of sensitive information to be re-entered again and again, because that is actually not good from the user's point of view, because of the privacy reason and for the security reason as well. So we need to balance all these things. That's something that's a different ball game, I would say. And then the visibility and the navigation is another concern when you design the application. How to provide the minimization, maximization, scroll bars. Uh, uh, we don't want to put all the information in a one screen as well, so we need to provide the scroll bars. Because sometimes the information overload, how are you going to overcome that part as well, right? So yeah, that's something you need to think about it, right? So when you're designing these user interfaces, right, so you can actually use drop down menus as well. And the shortcut keys can be listed in the menus itself, so the advanced users can use these shortcut keys rather than going mouse click. I actually never use something. I rather don't use these shortcut keys. I don't know whether you are using, but I'm not. See, I like to use mouse, to be honest. And this is something that we can actually implement for in your system as well. And maybe you can put some switches like slide bars, right, radio buttons, something like that, to give you a kind of a different information for the users. And actually these are the controls that we can implement. Rather than typing something, we can put control, so it can easily user can control the direction of processing of their data. Okay, so this is an example of Ridgeline Mount Fitters Windows format application. Remember that they use this system to this is actually designed for the internal staff to see how the system, what are the stock level, and what kind of products they are currently have. So this give a kind of an idea. It's a kind of a product picture as well in this kind of. It depends on the system you are designing. Okay. Okay. And then how you're going to organize the things in even when it comes to. And when you organize the things, we need to be bit careful. As this is an example of shopping cart. So here, I would say this is a very good way of uh, um, uh, organize the things. So when you, for example, this shopping cart shows you what kind of things with small image in my shopping basket, so I can actually give you a kind of an idea what is the total. This is from the Amazon, I believe. Yes, Amazon website, and then I can easily sometimes remove the stuff if I don't want. Okay, so this is kind of a very user-friendly interface, I would say, in this kind of environment. Okay. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, web-based applications and other kind of standalone applications need to be defined different ways, how their system works, because web-based application use a different technology, right? Standalone computers like our PCs may be working a different technology, right? So all these things we need to consider when you design. So your applications environment is very important. We will discuss that in week 12. Environment of your application, trying to implement in very important matter, because it depends. It actually give you kind of it actually dictates everything, from layout to everything, the environment it operates. So so that is something we need to consider as well. Now, this is actually an example website. This is called a million. Whether you have seen this one, if you go to this website actually contains millions, hundred thousands of advertising pages, right? So, so this actually purpose is quite different, because they are selling the small spaces to the companies so they can advertise their products. So this is, they have different purposes. Okay. In some in our application probably we don't need, because we need to consider these things when you design, because sometimes some application when they design, they give some space for the advertising, Google ads, so adware kind of things. So we don't need to consider if you design this for a kind of a business purpose, but for some other purposes, of course we need to consider how to organize these things. Okay. And then this is a Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters shopping cart system. So you can see that in the shopping cart, they also provide some controls there, because if the user wanted to change anything, they can do it in the shop, within the shopping cart itself, rather than going back and then back and forth. So that is something that you can think about when you implement some kind of this kind of capability. And there are some challenges, as I mentioned, when the main problem in nowadays, in modern days, is how you're going to actually implement, how you're going to design the system to fit in different context, right? Because the screen sizes, keyboards, now we use a touch screens, right? So, and also voice commands, we are using voice commands, and then the network capacities, right? Bandwidth capacity. So these things need to be considered when you're designing the application itself, right? And along with some other things, right? Uh, Especially the smartphone context, it's different ball game, I would say. Layout and formatting quite different, and it's a quite huge challenge when it comes to data entry for small screen sizes. So you need to think about that, how you're going to organize your screen to best fit into a given context. And then the navigation and about navigation of your application is something that we need to think about as well. Okay. But at the same time, we need to give a kind of a site map for the users, because we need to have to properly navigate the application, even they use small devices. So how are you going to actually include that in your application? That's a big challenge. Now this is a very good example for the Ridgeline Mountain Outfitters. Though they designed this home page, you can see very less images. So they have only one image in the top left hand corner. So that's their home page. And then they have kind of a vertical kind of organization of their menu. So it's very clear and plain. Any person can see what kind of functions they have implemented in their system. Oh, so what kind of functionality? So that's for the tablets, tablet displays, tablets, it's quite different, because we have much little bit room for to display the stuff compared to smartphones. But again, little challenges still there with respect to desktop. Okay. So these are the things that we need to consider when it comes to user interface design. And the other considerations that we need to think about is the reports or statements, right? Because now, so we design the user interface basically the to capture the data, right? We need the reports as well, because we need to actually provide some information back to the users in forms of the reports. So when it comes to reports also, there are different kinds of reports that we can generate. It can be more detailed reports or more summarized kind of reports for more management levels, or we can have exception reports. If something goes wrong, how you produce exception, what kind of information we need to include in exception reports, or maybe executive type of reports, very high level management, to give a kind of a idea of the overall health of the organization performance. So yeah, so these are the things that we can actually think. So when it comes to detailed reports, we may have reports like these shopping carts, or the something really very detailed, so it has a very granular information. So, and then the first thing we need to actually think about when it comes to the reports, who are the users of each of these reports? What is their purpose? Why they use this, right? So what kind of information they require from reports, right? What decisions they are trying to make from these reports? This is need to be considered before we design these report formats for the users. Okay. Um, so I have given some examples of different report formats. Some information are organized in different ways in the reports. Um, and then the other thing that we need to think about nowadays, actually, people are not printing the reports, right? We are using electronic means to display the reports. So electronic reports are really, and one of the advantage of electronic report is we can drill down the information, right? And we can dynamically change the information as when required, right? Rather than the printed report we can print means that's enough, right? But when we use these electronic reports, of course, then we can dynamically change the contents. And then we can actually give a kind of a hyperlinks for different parts of the report, so that the users can navigate what they require in electronic reports. That's another advantage of electronic reports. So one advantage, as mentioned, drilling down the information, and or maybe we can provide some summarized information reports like these charts and graph, and that's another advantage. Right, so that's actually the end of today's lecture. It's not much, it's basically the user interface designs. So what you need to actually know in this class, of course, you will get some kind of some info, questions in your final test. Basically, this is theory. So what you need to do in terms of your project is you need to actually do this. Probably we may have a couple of questions in next week tutorial. Probably you will practice this in your first tutorial, how to design this dialogue. From the dialogue, how you convert the dialogue to the storyboard, because this storyboard itself play a significant role in designing your menus, right? So this is the first cut version of the menus on your system. So how are you going to design this? This is what you need to actually consider next week, because in your project you need to select one use case and you need to design the screens based on that use case storyboard. So you need to design the storyboard and sketch diagrams like this, how it looks like your interface. Okay. All right, so that is the end of the lectures today, guys. So do you have any questions? I think there are a lot of theoretical aspects I have discussed today. You may have a lot of questions. Probably you can ask that in next week. Tutorial, we may have tutorial question next week, so we can practice some of these what we have learned.